So this is part two of World War II, the American Homefront. We're going to pick up with Mexican American families. They served their country well as well. They experienced discrimination in American society. In 1943, Los Angeles exploded in an anti-Mexican American riot. It's called the Zoot Suit Riot. So I kind of tell you real quick down here. Basically, what happens is naval sailors beat Zoot Suiters senseless in the streets of Los Angeles. There's a bar fight. And out of all of this, the Zoot Suiters, these are basically long suits worn with pleated pants and broad-brimmed hats. If you say that sounds familiar, it should. The style has come back today. A lot of Zoot Suits are worn today. But they were blamed. The Zoot Suiters were blamed for this riot, and because there was such a pro-American or pro-military movement supporting World War II, Mexican-American youth were banned from wearing Zoot Suits. Basically, they rebelled against this tradition of these were young Mexican Americans, and they wore these Zoot Suits, and they were rebelling. Quite stylish, actually, but Los Angeles, their response was to ban the Zoot Suits and side with the sailors. So we need to talk about the suspension of civil liberties during World War II. FDR has to make a series of decisions, very important decisions, within 24 hours after Pearl Harbor. The only one that he makes, because he had been preparing for this for about 3 or 4 years, about us getting into World War II. The only questionable decision he makes is suspending Japanese American civil liberties. And he does this because the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. They crippled our base at Pearl Harbor, and we knew that there were Japanese American spies, a couple of them, involved with the planning of this attack. We didn't know if the Japanese were going to invade the American main shore, the West Coast, and so FDR has 110,000 Japanese Americans moved to different states from the West Coast. They were not allowed to stay on the West Coast. So we basically took 110,000 families, most of them second generation Japanese Americans, and we moved them to states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Alabama, Florida, and New York State, to name a few of them. And we set up what is called internment camps. And I've got some pictures for you. You can see them. But you got to remember, these internment camps had soldiers with guns protecting and keeping these Japanese Americans inside of these camps. So what happens to their businesses that they run? What happens to the places they work? They got fired. They lost their businesses. And at the end of World War II, the federal government gave these Japanese Americans $25. The $25 covered the train ride back to the West Coast. So you say, well, wait a minute. These Japanese American families didn't go to court. Their due process of the law was not withheld. Habeas corpus prevents us from holding any American in jail or in an internment camp no longer than 48 hours without being charged with a crime. All of that was suspended. Remember, Abraham Lincoln starts this with the spies, suspected spies of the Civil War. And basically, FDR says, hey, look, we don't know who's a spy and who's not, so we're going to intern them all. In 1945, Fred Korematsu sues the United States government for this. And he says that's against my constitutional right, and he loses. Basically, the Supreme Court says you can detain a group due to military urgency or national security. And understand, guys, when your individual rights come into conflict with that of the community wins. So to this day, we will detain people in times of war that could be a danger to our society. The last president to use this would have been President George W. Bush after the 9/11 bombing. We incarcerate about 6,000 to 7,000 Muslim Americans, and he held them in prison held them in jail up to about 7 to 8 years after it happened. So I believe he, at the end of his administration, or President Obama, allowed the last remaining Muslim Americans out. And there have been suits, but they've lost because of national security. So Japanese Americans had two choices during World War II, especially Japanese American men had two choices. They could live in an internment camp, or they could fight for the U.S. Army. And a lot of them chose to fight against Germany in the U.S. Army. What we did was we took German and Italian immigrants, sons of immigrants, and they served in the Pacific, and we took Western people, Asian American people, and they served in Europe. So there wouldn't be any spying going on. So Japanese Americans fought in what was the 442nd Go for Broke. Look them up. They are the most decorated unit of all of World War II. They fought in the Italian campaign. They fought in North Africa, and they're still receiving medals for their valor in combat. Keep in mind, they had no rights at home. Their families were being detained, and they go overseas and they fight harder and win more medals than any other American regiment, battalion in World War II. So, if you look at these signs, if you look at the sign down at the bottom, this is a lady's house in, I believe it's the South. But basically, if you read it, it says, Japs keep moving on. It's a white man's neighborhood, and it basically says, the other sign says, Japs keep out. You're not wanted. Keep in mind, these are Americans. So, here's some of the Japanese internment notes you need. Continue. Basically, you have Jackal has been created, and this is a Japanese American Citizenship League, and they push the government to compensate these families of these camps. Congress will reimburse families in 1954 at $1,000. I believe 1965 was $1,500 to $2,000, but in 1989, President H.W. Bush says this will be the final time we give money out, and we're going to give money out to these families, and we're going to write this off into the passage of history, and each family would receive $20,000. And a lot of families took advantage of that, but I personally did research on a couple of families who didn't take advantage of none of it, and it destroyed their lives. So, propaganda of World War II. You have the propaganda offices of World War II, just like in World War I. They use posters, newsreels, pamphlets to influence opinion at home and abroad. All right, you can watch this video here. It goes through the propaganda, a little bit of World War II to help you out with one of your activities. So how people got their news during World War II. You went to the movie, you paid your 3 or 4 cent nickel to watch a movie, and the first 15 minutes of the movie could be a report. Typically, reports come in about 2 weeks after to a month after the event happened in World War II, but that's how we didn't have news agencies like NBC News, ABC News. We didn't have those back then. They went to the movie theaters and they got their information. If you guys are big fans of the Three Stooges, they were that first 15 minutes before the movie played, that they were called shorts, and they would play these shows before movies started. So during World War II, they would run newsreels about once every 2 weeks. And we are finished.